All right, I'm Eric Scheske. This is a Theology on Tap session, or as I said during the Mass, it's probably more like a history on tap. A couple housekeeping matters. I'm going to try to get this done in 30 minutes. That's the goal. I did a dry run like 2 weeks ago. It took me an hour and a half. got it down to an hour. Then did the handout. Got it down to about 40 minutes. I think I'll be right around 30 minutes. After the lecture, you can come and go for 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to break. If you don't want to stick around for the questions and answer, that's fine. If you do, great. But you don't have to be for half an hour to get the gist of it. So, all right. Again, questions afterwards, not during. You throw me off, and then I'll get all flustered, and then So, all right. We're starting. This is the Catholic history in 30 minutes. If you didn't know that, okay. So we're starting about the year 125, 150. So it's about 100 years after Christ died. Christ died about 30 A.D. But I want you to know two things from the previous 100 years. Take two things away from this lecture. Matthew 16:18. Okay? Everyone know what Matthew 16:18 is? It's a verse where Christ goes as Simon and changes his name. And if you look throughout the Old Testament, whenever Christ changes someone's name, he has something big planned for them. Okay? Abram to Abraham. But something big is going to happen. And he tells Simon, he says, your name is now Peter, which in Greek means Petros, which is stone, or in Aramaic means Kephas, which is rock. He says, on this rock, I'll establish my church. And it's a Catholic position that was the church that Christ founded. Peter goes to Rome. The historical evidence is not conclusive, but it's pretty good that Peter went to Rome and with Paul established the church there, became the first bishop. Peter dies. He had a successor named Linus, and then Anacletus and Clement, 266 popes down to today. We can trace it straight up back from St. Francis all the way back to St. Peter. I always thought Linus was so important, I made my kids memorize the name Linus. And if they could say it, they could have dinner that night. So it's kind of harsh going up to my house. So second thing I want you to take away, read the Gospels, okay? In the Gospels, you'll be struck by a continuing phrase. Basically, it says he went about preaching. He went about teaching the synagogues, okay? And then the other references to he taught the disciples in private. No reference in the Gospels what he was saying when he was saying these things, okay? And we can assume he wasn't a stand-up comedian doing the same shtick over and over again, okay? So he is saying things that we have no idea what they were, okay? Or I shouldn't say no idea. We don't know what they were for sure because the Gospels don't record it. The Gospel of John ends on a similar type of note where it said, there's so many more things we could report. We couldn't even, the world couldn't hold all the books, okay? It's the church's position that's where tradition comes from, that Christ actually implemented an institution called the church. When he died, rose again, he passed it on, okay? So take those two things away. It wasn't like these church things evolved over many centuries. Right out of the gate, we had a church, okay? We had that corroborated by Justin Martyr. I have a handout there. Justin Martyr is a fascinating individual. He was born in 100 A.D. He was actually a Catholic convert, and he wrote down what the early church was like. And if you read the handout, it's kind of jaw-dropping. If you look at what the Mass was like, for instance, it's the same Mass we have today. So people are bored by the Mass, they want to change it up a little bit. It's like, well, you got to take it up with the big guy, and not Father Vilio, but the big guy, not the Pope, but the one above, okay? Because arguably that's what was instituted, okay? That's why I do the Mass. That's why I don't change the liturgy that much, okay? Justin Martyr. Significant about Justin Martyr, keep in mind you're talking about a guy who could have hung out and drank beer with people who hung out and drank beer with the apostles. We're not talking 100 years, 200 years. We're talking pretty close chronological, nearness, okay? So it's really significant that you have a guy like Justin Martyr saying these things, and we know very, very early on that a guy who could have known guys who knew the apostles was saying these things about the church. So what else do we know about the early church? Well, we know the name Martyr, okay? Being a Christian in the Roman Empire was not an easy thing. Martyrdom was never far away. There are lots of persecutions for primarily just one reason. The Roman Church is very tolerant of other religions, with one caveat: you worship their gods too. So if you're monotheistic, that's fine, that's cool, as long as you're not monotheistic. That was the rule. And if you don't sacrifice to the gods, you're drawing down the empire, you're a drag on society, and you're going to be persecuted. Jailed, tortured, killed. and that was like the highest calling for a Christian is basically to be martyred. Not everyone held up to it. A lot of people buckled, but that was part of being a Christian back in those first 300 years or so, 250 years. All that stops in 313. Okay, if you want to memorize dates, memorize the year 313. 313, there's a Christian emperor named Constantine. And Constantine says, this crap stops now. Okay, there'll be no more persecution of the Christians. Constantine himself was kind of nominally Catholic, okay, but he believed, and he goes, this is not going to happen anymore. And it stopped. And he actually made the church, basically acknowledged the church as an institution. It could inherit property, it could hold property. It became basically a societal force. And the Roman Empire at that point came wrapped up with the Christian faith, okay, with the Catholic faith. About 50 years later, Emperor Theodosius took it one step further and said, well, not only is this a sanctioned religion, it is the only religion. And they started tearing down the pagan temples at that point, okay? And in my opinion, this is where it really starts getting interesting with the Catholic Church. Because at this point, you can openly be Christian. Instead of 15-20% of the population being Christian, you have the majority being Christian. And you start getting, people but they still want the martyrdom. You can't be killed anymore because Constantine said, knock it off. If you mess with the Christians, you mess with me, okay? But people still kind of yearn for that martyrdom in a way. That was the highest calling of a Christian. So what were they going to do now? Well, they opted for a thing, many did, for a thing called what they call white martyrdom. Shortly before Constantine, a guy named St. Anthony the Great was in Egypt. He sold all his possessions and he moved out to an abandoned fort out in Egypt. And by worldly terms, he did nothing all day and he ate nothing all day. In spiritual terms, we say he prayed and fasted. Okay? And that's all he did. He prayed and fasted, always. People got wind of it. They remember St. Anthony lived back in town. And so they started going out there to see this freak show. Let's see what this guy's doing. I envision teenagers out there throwing eggs at the fort, It's like this guy's out there living by himself, doing nothing, eating nothing. But they go out and meet St. Anthony, and they start realizing this guy's not a freak. And they're actually impressed with what they saw. They thought they were going to meet a freak. Instead, they met a guy who actually had good advice. The guy could tell them a lot of things about themselves, and very wise. So people started flocking out to see him, saying, come see the holy man. Some people didn't leave. They wanted to be near the holy man. They started setting up cells around the holy man. St. Anthony didn't like that. He wanted to be by himself, but that's what happened. So he basically spawns what's called the anchorite movement, hermits, which is, again, completely deny myself short of being killed because I can't do that anymore. So I deny myself by giving everything away, moving out to the desert. That spawned all sorts of freaky movements. You had like the dendrites, they're called. These are people who hermits lived in trees. You had stylites. Stylites, they built these great tall 10, 20, 30-foot podiums, and they lived up there. Their disciples had to bring them food up on pulleys, and they preached from there. I expect they defecated there. It just sounds pretty nasty, but they're there 24/7, didn't come down for years, okay? The church never really approved of these things. Fortunately, a man named Pacmonius, shortly after Anthony, started organizing these people into communities, started saying, you really shouldn't be out there by yourself. You really ought to kind of live in a community, and that kind of spawns a monastic movement. And we'll come back to monasticism a couple more times throughout this lecture. Let me see where I am here. Oh, the other thing, keep in mind, as soon as Christianity becomes like the state religion, all sorts of stupidity erupts. Now that you can openly talk about your faith, people are openly talking idiocy. Okay, there was a heresy for everything. There's nothing too stupid. There's a group of believers called the pagan nose people who thought you should walk around with your fingers in your nose and your mouth. Okay, we don't know much about them, but I assume they had real small hands. But yeah, big noses. Yeah, maybe it's the Ethiopians or something. But yeah. So again, there's no heresy too stupid at this time period, but there were some heresies that couldn't be messed around with, had to be taken very seriously. Yeah, I'm going to discuss three, okay? There's probably 4 or 5 major ones. I'm going to discuss 3. First off, you have the Donatists, big in North Africa. They said basically one thing. If you buckled during the persecutions, if you gave it up and sacrificed to the gods, you're not worthy, and the sacraments you administer aren't worthy. The church quickly condemned this. I mean, it's a very powerful movement, but a moment's reflection tells you can't have this. I mean, it'd be spiritual anarchy. Imagine the poor people with scruples who never know if they confessed all their sins. Now they know if the priest confessed all his sins because he was stained. So Donatism kind of died a quick death, although it was a very powerful movement. You had the Arians, a very, very powerful movement. Basically taught that there was a time, since Christ proceeds from the Father, there was a time when Christ wasn't. Therefore, Christ must be a created being, which makes him something less than God. More than man, but less than God. Arius, the guy who preached it, wasn't real clear. That was condemned. We have our Nicene Creed. Year 325, Constantine said, I'm tired of all this cotton-picking bickering. Let's get together in Nicaea and figure it out. And the Orthodox position won, and we had the Nicene Creed from this to this day. Okay. My favorite heresy, not because it's funny, but just because the backlash was so harsh, was Monophysitism. This is the 5th century. Monophysitism taught that Christ didn't have two natures. You know, we teach Christ is fully human, fully man, or fully God. Monophysitism said he has two natures. I mean, one nature, excuse me. This heresy fascinates me. It was condemned at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. But church councils always resolve these type of issues, okay, typically. But anyway, so in 451, the council says, no, that's not right. He has two natures, not one. The Monophysites didn't take it lying down, though. You know, heretics never do, quite frankly. Very few capitulate and say, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. They continue to be disruptive. Okay, Monophysites, really, really disruptive, partly because they had the emperor at the time on their side. They had the former empress on their side, and they had thousands or tens of thousands of monks on their side. And they thought that Council of Chalcedon dissed a guy named St. Cyril, his teachings, which it didn't, but that's what they thought. And so they were rioting in the streets. Finally, it's finally pushed out to the outskirts of the empire, out like near Iraq and stuff, which is fascinating because we have Monophysites today, which people don't realize that. You're not going to find an Arian, at least not a body of them. You're not going to find Donatists. You will find Monophysites, okay? Because what happened, they pushed out to the outside of the empire. They got thrashed when the Muslims invaded about 150 years later. The first Christians that the Muslims found coming out of Saudi Arabia were the Monophysites, who didn't fare too well. A lot of them converted to Islam. They're already psychologically kind of thinking one nature anyway, so it's kind of a smaller jump for them. But they did persevere through lots of persecution, and today we call them Copts, C-O-P-T-S. So they're with us today. Something I find very fascinating is that the Copts actually, they're in full communion with the Greek Orthodox Church as of, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. At some point, they got together, they compared notes, and they said, you know, we weren't that far apart. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have been so lousy to each other. You know, so the Greek Orthodox Church and the Copts are now in full communion. I know the hope was John Paul II, he wanted to unify with the Greek Orthodox Church, which had it been pulled off, would have actually all the ancient churches that trace the roots back to the apostles all would have been all in full communion with Rome at that point. We're not quite there yet, but we'll get there eventually. We're very close. We're like this far from unifying with the Greek Orthodox Church. Unfortunately, there's a wall like this big between it. So, but we're close, but oh so far still. Let me see. This period also brings in, right now we're in the 5th century. And by the way, does everyone understand 5th century? When I say 5th century, I'm talking 400s. I'm saying 21st century today, I'm talking, you know, the 2000s. 5th century, something pretty significant happens. St. Patrick comes along, okay? And I'll talk about the New World during this session. It's too much to get in. But St. Patrick is sent to Ireland. That was huge because Christianity, the Catholic Church, had kind of become identified with the Roman Empire. If it's Roman, it's us. If it's us, it's Roman. And if you're a Roman citizen, you're a Catholic. That's the way it was. And then they said, well, St. Patrick didn't go to Ireland. Ireland was never within the old bounds of the Roman Empire. Again, I don't know where this type of psychological thing came from. We have good evidence that the Apostle Thomas went to India, which is well outside the Roman Empire. But anyway, St. Patrick goes there, and now people realize, and he had such success converting the Irish people, everyone now realized the whole world's fair game. Okay, without St. Patrick, arguably, we don't have a New World type, you know, missionary type efforts. So St. Patrick is huge. St. Patrick is also huge because he gives us the first example, the fruits of his labor give us the first example of what we're seeing today. He goes to Ireland, he converts the Irish people. England at the time is Catholic. England gets overrun about this time by the Anglos and Saxons out of Germany, who are pagan. England's Christian faith is pretty much extinguished. Through King Alfred, and some others, there's kind of an accord reached, but there's nothing left of Christianity. The Irish monks come over from Ireland. So you have an example of a former pagan people being Christianized by Christian people, returning the favor. Kind of like we're seeing today when what may be our pagan culture. The United States today, we have to bring in priests from Africa or Colombia, in our case, to serve us because we just don't have enough. So this goes right back to St. Patrick. So that's why St. Patrick is awfully significant. How far am I time right now? So anyway, I want to shift over to basically the fall of the Roman Empire. If you ask about the fall of the Roman Empire, they'll say the Roman Empire fell in 476. That's not true. Okay, the Roman Empire greatly dwindled about this time, but if you would ask the average citizen in France, who are you a citizen of in 600, he goes, I'm a Roman citizen. Okay, Rome at that time only had about 20,000 people living in it, but they would have all said, I'm a Roman citizen. And Rome had about 1 million. So we're talking like a decline in Rome that makes Detroit look good by comparison. Okay, it reminds me of my brother-in-law Stan. His father-in-law is from Italy. They go back to Rome, and he wanted to see the Colosseum. And his father-in-law says, Stanley, why do you want to see the Colosseum? It's a dump. When I was a teenager, we would shit in the Colosseum. And he was dead serious. I don't know, apparently the UN didn't have it on the heritage site yet. But apparently, I think people are probably shitting in the Colosseum back in 600 as well, okay? Because Rome is already greatly being decrepit, falling apart. But people still thought themselves as Roman citizens, okay? Fortunately, even though the Roman Empire is declining, you have these barbarian kingdoms rising, okay? And they're all Arians, which is a huge problem. The Pope's basically surrounded by Arians, heretical Christians. But then a man named Clovis converts to Catholicism. And furthermore, he didn't do it for kicks or do it for political reasons, because he was surrounded by Arians. It's been easy to become an Arian. He actually believed this stuff, okay? And he was the king of the Franks, okay? The Franks have very little in common with today's French. Yeah, France, the same people, but these were tough guys. In fact, they were the tough guys in the continent. No one messed with the Franks, okay? Again, nothing in common with today's French except maybe the lack of deodorant. These are very, very tough people, and it came down with, you mess with the Pope, you mess with the Franks, okay? So when Attila the Hun, back in the 400s, got ready to invade Rome, Leo goes out there to deal with them. And the reason Leo goes out there is because there's a power vacuum. And so the Pope and the bishops, they're tossed into this political scene because no one else could deal with the stuff, okay? So Attila the Hun's knocking on Rome, getting ready to invade. Leo the Great goes out there and talks to him. Attila leaves. It's a miracle. We don't know why he left. Some say, well, Attila saw Peter and Paul overhead over Leo and kind of freaked out and left. Some say Leo was so holy, he's a saint, that Attila was so impressed he left. Some say Leo gave him a lot of money. I lean towards the last one. I'm kind of skeptical, I guess, but we never know. Maybe it was all three, but anyway, he left. But that's to be symbolic to you that Leo had to do that. What's Leo out there doing with the savage like Attila the Hun? There's no one else left to do it. So he had this power vacuum. But the Pope didn't have much by way of armies. Clovis was his army. And Clovis' successors were his army. If you threaten the Pope, you're threatening the Franks, and the Franks came in. The Lombards constantly threatened the Pope. The Lombards are from Germany. They're good warriors. They pretty much conquered most of the Italian peninsula. The whole Pope just kept calling the Franks. It's like, fine, I got to get them back in here. And the Franks always won. That culminated in 750. Stephen II's really has a dire threat. He calls in Pepin. Pepin comes in, thrashes the Lombards, like always. But this time, Pepin's like, I'm not sure I can always be here for you. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to take this territory I took from the Lombards, and I'm going to give it to you. We call it the Papal States, okay? And he goes, so, next time you have your own armies, you have your own land, you have your own resources to fend off these type of barbarians. Not a good idea. Because now what do you have? You have a Pope who's now king, okay? And now you really start, you already saw with Leo, you already start seeing state in church starting to get intertwined. Now they're downright intertwined. And when the Pope dies and a new Pope has to be appointed, powerful families want their man in. Because that means money, that means warriors, that means power. And so now the church really starts becoming, corrupt in a lot of ways because the popes themselves aren't there to be spiritual leaders. They're there to be powerful, to help their families be more powerful. So it's a huge problem. Pepin meant well, but it caused problems. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, becomes king of the Franks. Same thing, Lombards are threatening. He goes down. Leo III, though, on that time, does something a little bit different. He crowns Charlemagne as the Roman emperor. Again, the Roman Empire basically fallen more or less in 476. We hadn't had an emperor in this part of the continent for 300 years. 334 years, but now you had an emperor. And Charlemagne took the crown, which I never really, they still dispute what that means. Why did Charlemagne take the crown? That would make me crowning Bill Gates the wealthiest man in the world. It's like, well, he's the wealthiest man whether they crown him or not. Charlemagne's king no matter what he does. So anyways, he crowns him, and at that point, you have this really weird thing. It's like, Charlemagne's like, I've been crowned by the Pope, that gives me some sort of spiritual authority. But I have some sort of responsibility, religious, warlike responsibility for the Pope. So the two become that much more intertwined, creating more problems. Okay. After Charlemagne dies, the Vikings come. This is the Dark Ages, 850 to 950. This is the area, this is the time period that just sucks, okay, for Europe. The Vikings are fierce. People don't understand, these aren't a sideshow. These are fierce people. They had an overpopulation problem, apparently. Hard to believe by Scandinavian sexual standards today. It reminds me of a joke I thought of last week during Mass. Sorry. What do Swedish seamen and the Easter Bunny have in common? Neither exist. But back then, though, the Scandinavians were producing prolifically, okay? And they had no more land, so they poured out of the north. Huge problems. There's a string of scholars today who think Scandinavian women are so hot because when the Vikings first raided, they took the best-looking women back with them. True story. Like, the good-looking women from Europe are gone. They're up in Scandinavia. But eventually, they actually settled. They say, hey, it's warmer down here, it's nicer down here, we're settling here. And they slowly started converting, okay, because they settled in Christian lands and they married Christian wives. And the Vikings overall finally converted in total by about late 900s. And that's huge. And keep in mind, we still have missionary activities. You had Cyril and Methodius converted the Slavs. I just want to read, I did actually write this down, but during this time period, you have like Poland, the Slavic countries, all converting in the same time period. So by 1000, you have a very powerful arc. Everything from Dublin to Moscow, from Oslo down to Palermo, Sicily, it's all Catholic. Okay? And yes, they bickered and they warred among themselves, but everyone else was an outsider, and they became a real force. Okay, Dark Ages are over by 1000, which is very significant. How much time am I at, sweetheart? What am I at?
22 minutes.
22 minutes, okay. So a bunch of things happen after 1000. You have a monastic renewal. I love the studies of monasticism. Here's what happened. People like St. Anthony go out, they found a monastery, okay? They're holy. They're not doing this for money. They really believe this stuff, okay? People come with them, and they get a reputation for holiness. Rich people, the laymen, are impressed, so they give up money. Okay? They couldn't do this before. Back when the Vikings were there, there's an old saying that said the Vikings came to Europe to rid Europe of the curse of gold, because they took all the gold. So commerce pretty much just dwindled. There's no means of exchange. So they had to pay their warriors in land to support their warriors. Monasteries suffered from this. Well, after 1000, commerce returns. You can start endowing monasteries, and they take off. You have Cluny, the Cistercians, Carthusians, all established during this time. They have 1,000 affiliate monasteries among just those three. Now think about it, you're talking thousands of monasteries just explode on the scene here over the next couple hundred years. The 11th century also is the height of papal power. We're talking about, the papal states. Well, it reached its height. What happened there? Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, Gregory VII, we call him Hildebrand, they get in a dispute over investitures. Basically, who gets to appoint the bishops? Because again, bishops have power, still do. They have land, okay? So Henry IV says, I do. Gregory VII says, I do. It's a stalemate. Gregory VII excommunicates Henry IV. Henry IV wasn't much of a Christian. I don't think he really cared, but the German nobles use it as an excuse to strike against the Holy Roman Empire. They start rebelling. Henry IV has to freak out. He sits for 2 days in the snow, asks for forgiveness from Gregory VII. Gregory VII forgives him. And it's really humiliating for the Holy Roman Empire, but that's considered like the apex, the very highest of Vatican power in the political sphere. We'll see this dynamic repeat itself in a couple hundred years. With the end of the Dark Ages and return of commerce, you have another monastic renewal in the sense of like St. Anthony, in the sense that people are saying, we ought to be poor. Christ was poor, Christ died, what's with this wealth prosperity? This prosperity gospel. We need to be poor. This is a backlash against all the wealth. That's where St. Francis and St. Dominic come from, okay? This time also you see Europe going on the offensive, okay? You have, I mentioned all these different groups invading Europe. At this time we go back, we take it back to the Muslims in the form of the Crusades, okay? And the Crusades would be a great lecture, by the way, but what you have to understand about the Crusades is an uneasy peace had come in reach between the Muslims and the Christians, and the Muslims would control the Holy Lands, and our pilgrims could go there and worship unmolested. Unfortunately, the Seljuk Turks invaded Asia Minor, started putting pressure on the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire goes to the west and says, you guys are doing pretty well for yourself now, can you send some of these guys over to help us fight? We're tempted, but not sure we want to disrupt this uneasy relationship. Well, then the Seljuk Turks said, why are we letting these infidels into our country to go to the Holy Lands? So they start attacking them. The popes say, we have a lot of young men who want to fight because we've been very populous for the past 100 years. And they come out and they come back and say, I think we can take these guys. The Seljuk Turks aren't that tough. We're fighting them on these pilgrims. And they invade in mass force. Urban II calls for a crusade. And they have limited success. We actually set up crusader kingdoms. And it goes well for a little while. But then ultimately they give way to demographics. Just you're in a Muslim sea and it's just the kingdom's folded, kind of like Europe is today. During this time period you have, again, this is the height of Catholic culture. You have St. Thomas Aquinas, probably the best thinker of all time. Will Durant, fallen away Catholic, no tolerance for Catholic thought whatsoever, but a fair man. He ranks St. Thomas Aquinas as number 3 thinker of all time. And coming from a secularist like Will Durant, that's quite a compliment. Universities get established, you have the Sorbonne, you have Cambridge, Oxford, Salamanca, all established during this time period. The mystics are rock stars. You can just go through a who's who's list of mystics. John Roll, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, Bonaventura, Meister Eckhart, all popular, famous. These are like the celebrities of the day, mystics. That's what Europe was like. Unfortunately, at this point, the decline sets in. I analogize if you golf, and you're on the 12th hole, you're having a great round, okay? You chip in 125 yards out and you eagle hole number 12, you're having a great round. And then you get a hole number 13, you duff it in the woods. You go back to the tee box and you duff it again. You end up taking a 20, okay, on the hole. Your round shot. That's the 1300s, okay? Now I wish I could spend more time on 1300s, but you have famines, you have crop failures. You have the Avignon captivity, where a Frenchman became pope and said he'd rather live in Avignon. That went on for 70 years. His successor, Gregory XI, came back. Catherine Siena pressured him to. He thought Catherine Siena had effectively killed 2 of his predecessors because she told them to go back, and they ignored her and they dropped dead. So Gregory XI goes back to Rome, but there's a tarnishing. This idea that this is kind of a French thing, it's not a Roman. The Romans still had, they still had this aura. If it's Rome, it's universal, okay? When they went to Avignon, that tarnished its reputation. And then after Gregory dies, Urban VI gets appointed. Urban VI was a real SOB, okay? Mentally unstable, we're not sure, but he used his power as pope to take vengeance on his adversaries, even torturing some cardinals. Cardinals got together and said, that wasn't a bad election, let's elect someone else. You can't do that. You're pope for life unless you resign. Urban wasn't given up this power slot, so now you have 2 popes. It's called the Great Western Schism. A group of peacekeepers come together and they said, okay, fine, you 2 are done, we'll have a 3rd pope. So now you have 3 popes out there. And now the church is just a laughing stock. You have 3 popes, because the other 2 didn't resign. They all said, no, we're all valid. So this went on for, again, I think about 70 years, and 14, 18 or so. This gets resolved at a council, and Martin V is appointed, and the others step aside. But the damage has been done. The reputation that you're talking in the early 1400s, it's terrible, the reputation of the Vatican. And now you have the plague hitting. People don't understand the plague. We joke about it today, but just figure half of the European population wiped out by the plague. possibly even worse, far more than half of the clergy are wiped out. Okay, what people don't understand, I know I'm running low on time, but it's kind of scientific. The best way to deal with the plague. When the plague first hit your town, what you do is you take all your clothes and you put them on a table. Okay, and you wrap twine around them, and you put your clothes under your arm, and you get the hell out. That's what you do. To avoid the plague, you get out of town. Okay, the good clergy don't do that. The good clergy, they stay back, because they want to care for the sick and suffering. So you have 60, 70, 80% of the clergy, the nuns and priests, wiped out by the plague. In Paris, an entire order was completely wiped out, 100% all gone. So now socioeconomically, you have just a train wreck of a culture. The best parts of society are all dead as well. So it's almost like you're starting from scratch in a lot of ways. You had the 100 Years' War. Again, everything that could go wrong in the 14th century went wrong. You had the 100 Years' War with Joan of Arc, but large parts of France destroyed. You have a school called nominalism kicking out. We got him, William Vaughan, that basically teaches a fierce type of subjectivism, that the only reality you can know is a reality in your head. Okay? And that led to kind of rejection of authority. And it actually leads down to thinking in the Reformation regarding, we don't need authority, the inner light's within ourselves type thing. So shift over to the Reformation, okay? 15 to 17, Martin Luther is upset that the Catholic Church is trafficking in indulgences. I can't get into indulgences, but basically you have to keep in mind a very fundamental distinction. The Catholic Church, if it's instituted by Christ himself, can be the means of grace, okay? And so the Catholic Church is like, Gabe's here, God's here, and the Catholic Church is going to help him through his sacraments to get Gabe to God, okay? The Reformers reject that notion. And so in that regard, by the way, they set the rules. This is how the sacraments, this is how grace is received. Indulgences are in that realm, okay? Luther rejects that, okay? So I always respect Luther. I never respect that either, though he's just out to reform it. I think he's out for rebellion right away because he rejects that fundamental premise. Hence he called the Pope the Antichrist, because he stands between God and man, okay? And once you reject that, all sorts of conclusions follow from it, which the Reformers followed rigorously. Coupled with this, you have a Holy Roman Empire that's possibly at its zenith in 1500. It's extremely powerful. The Habsburgs are militarily awesome. They have intermarried with other powerful families, and they control large swaths of Europe. And people are kind of freaked out about this. The Pope himself is freaked out by the Habsburgs, okay? So when Luther then gets in this fight with the Pope excommunicates Luther. Luther has a Saxony in his side already. Other princes, just like they did with Henry IV, say, this is our chance. Let's take a shot at the Habsburgs. We can join Luther, and we can start grabbing church land, we can start grabbing lands from the Habsburgs, and basically all hell breaks loose, okay? This will culminate in the 30 Years' War, where the Habsburgs, even though they had lots of adversaries, were so powerful they constantly won. They constantly beat their Protestant adversaries. And you had the Danish Lutherans came to the Protestants' aid to bail out, to beat the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs then turn around and they beat the next force, but then the Swedish Lutherans bail them out. And then finally, Catholic France bails out the Protestant forces, because France really hated the Habsburgs. So it wasn't about religion to Catholic France. It was all political war. This finally gets resolved with the Treaty of Westphalia, okay? 43. Treaty of Westphalia is huge for modern eras because under the Treaty of Westphalia, each nation picked its own religion, Lutheran or Catholic, and that's how they resolved it. So let's stop fighting, because even though it's largely political, no doubt religion was driving a lot of it. So the Treaty of Westphalia kind of resolved those things. These next things go pretty fast. 17th, 18th centuries, the Catholic Church's power just keeps plummeting, the papal seats keep shrinking. But fortunately, its religiosity keeps increasing, okay? It's like the less secular it becomes, the more spiritual it becomes. This basically comes to a conclusion in 1870. You have the King of Sardinia reunite Italy, often militarily. One of the last holdouts was the Papal States. They lost battle in 1870. Papal States are eliminated. that ended the Pope's entire temporal power was ended in 1870. Again, possibly a good thing. 1929, the papacy they got Vatican City back. That was Mussolini and the Italian legislature said through the Lateran Accord, we'll give you back Vatican City, which is what we have today. So it has its own state, but that's it, just Vatican City. And that's as far as we can go today. That's it. So all right. It is warm in here. Goodness gracious. So.